and welcome to part 2 of my deep dive into Madness and Sweeney Todd. Image description: I am still a white person with light brown hair sitting in front of a plain wall with leaves on it, but I've changed my outfit from a Joanna-inspired look to a Mrs. Lovett-inspired look. So I'm wearing a black lacy dress with roses on it, and my hair is in 2 messy buns, emphasis on the messy. Bless the costume wig designers, wig stylers, I don't know what the name of that job is, who put together these buns every night, because it's really hard to make 2 that are symmetric. Anyway, hi. If you want to watch part 1, which you definitely should before watching this video, because I don't think they're gonna make much sense out of order, part 1 covered the historical and narrative context for the characters that we're going to discuss in this video. So part 1 is linked right here up above and also at the top of the description. You can check that one out, and now let's get into part 2. Now, in looking at the characterization of Madness in the show, we're going to analyze 5 different characters. The Beggar Woman, obviously, Tobias Ragg, Joanna, Mrs. Lovett, and Sweeney Todd. The Beggar Woman is who I went to the show initially to see and study, intending to make a video about the history of institutionalization and how it applied to her, because I was just told that she existed. And then I found a lot of people around me laughing about how crazy and bonkers Mrs. Lovett and Sweeney Todd were, and Joanna was stimming, and Tobias was arguably developmentally disabled, and I was just like overcome with joy at how much you could play with in this show. It's just fantastic. I'm gonna go through each character, what we learn about them on the page, their portrayals in various productions, and then once we've done everybody, we will talk about what I felt worked and what didn't work in different productions, and what I think would work best, or what I would most like to see from this intellectual property going forward, make some sort of conclusion, and then call it a day. I also I want to explicitly say that every single performer and person on the creative team of every single one of these productions is absolutely fantastic. The critiques that I gave here are in reference to how they achieved specific narrative goals based on how I perceive madness as a mechanism within the story, which is sort of in line with the original directing and narrative choices of the show as I best understand them. So saying I don't necessarily love something does not mean that it wasn't very well performed or difficult or well crafted. It just means that it was in a different direction from how I personally see that character. Nothing to do with talent at all whatsoever. I feel like this is somewhat implicitly understood, but I now actively work in the industry with directors and actors and am a media reviewer at the same time, and I feel like I'm towing that line really weirdly and it stresses me out, so I wanted to be super clear about that. And I also want to add that somebody performing a character with disabled physicality or inflection does not equate me guessing at somebody's disabilities, nor is it judging somebody for copying things we associate with disability and their characters, disabled or not. The 2 primary reasons being that 1, nobody owns a specific kind of physicality. For example, non-autistic people stim literally all the time. And the other reason being that theatrical training teaches a lot of divergent movements and speech patterns and ascribes meaning to them, such as if you speak this way, this means that you're portraying this, or if you move this way, the audience will perceive this. So everybody in the realm of acting is going to be using large amounts of disabled characteristics in any character they create, just based on how we were trained and how everything needs to be slightly over the top to read to the audience anyway, and anything over the top in either direction is inherently seen as divergent, which then finds its way into the disabled category. I don't think that's inherently a problem. I almost enjoy how theater more further blurs the lines between what disabled people look like and what non-disabled folks look like, but I do think, or rather no, by the other side of what I do for research, is that the result of this visible difference implies this about a person's mental state or personality leads to a whole lot of discrimination towards disabled performers in their training. But half of my channel is for ranting about that, so let's start analyzing the Beggar Woman, also known as Lucy Barker, and not start ranting about accessible theater and education. So Lucy Barker is one of the characters I looked up different casting calls and printed versions of the show to figure out what character descriptions folks typically use for her. I came up with some real gems, such as woman with a split personality, a mad crone, and a deranged and schizophrenic woman. Awesome. Now to begin with, we don't actually know a whole ton about her, and the original stage directions also don't give many more clues other than that she sometimes looks at things, quote, vacantly, and she has claw-like hands, which could indicate various stims, physical issues, or literally absolutely nothing at all. Honestly, you can reflect anything in the DSM onto her and argue your point fairly reasonably. That's kind of why I prefer to call her just historically accurately mad and leave it at that, but for the sake of exercise, let's put a couple pieces together. The first thing, obviously, is the arsenic poisoning. We know from Mrs. Lovett that it left her weak in the head. All she did for months was just lie there in bed, should have been in hospital, wound up in Bedlam instead. Most research articles on the cognitive impacts of arsenic poisoning are centered around how they affect a child's neurological development due to overtime exposure from arsenic in drinking water, since that is a real problem in the world. Arguably, it would have been a very serious problem during this era specifically, so they probably all have some semblance of lead and arsenic poisoning. But in her case, we'll just ignore the rest of it. She was an adult when she took the arsenic, and she took it once and it failed to kill her. But one article did talk about acute and subacute exposure, so we're gonna roll with that as our explanation. Those symptoms are learning, memory, and movement disorders, often creating mood disorders such as depression and bipolar, along with general confusion and memory loss, as well as tendon weakness and gait disturbances, which may explain why she moves differently. She also may have gotten injured during her assault, that is unclear. There were also some mentions of potential personality changes as a result, I would assume because arsenic very easily crosses the blood-brain barrier and therefore can mess things up in the frontal lobes. Also, arsenic can cause seizures and comas, which affect long-term brain function, and we know from Lovett's line that she did spend months lying in bed and should have been in the actual hospital to receive medical care rather than in the madhouse, where she very probably did not receive any care, given that it was a public madhouse and not a private one, though also many private ones, much like Mr. Fogg's asylum, would not have offered care anyway. So either she was so depressed from her situation that she didn't get out of bed for several months, or she had some sort of significant physiological response to the arsenic poisoning. I think it is probably a combination of the two, with the majority of it being the second thing. We're gonna ignore the whole renal failure, migraines, chest pain, gastronomical issues situation, because she doesn't seem to be dealing with any of that in the show as we see her. And if she did have seizures early on, she doesn't seem to be currently having them. It has also occurred to me that in the adaptation Before Sondheim's, where this concept of poisoning oneself came from, it is just unspecified poison, and that arsenic is just a narrative device that isn't meant to have medically accurate results. And I guarantee you that nobody looked into this, but I am a thorough dude, and I would like to know. There's also the aspect that everybody's drinking water at the time, as I said earlier, had lots of toxins, so arguably everybody that we meet in this show has some semblance of mental disability from that. And I'm sure that there are things that we all use today that also cause mental impairment that we do not know about yet, so I'm not necessarily saying we're any better now. I still stand by my feelings that there's no such thing as a neurotypical person, and arguably the idea of all of them having some semblance of lead poisoning and arsenic poisoning would just be too much noise statistically to be analyzing, so we're just not going to deal with that. And then also in comparison to today, where we could have similar situations and not know about it. Anyway, I would say that maybe half of Lucy that we see in this show is directly related to arsenic, but it also does not take a doctor or any medical knowledge to see that a lot of why she is the way that she is directly caused by her situation. This woman got married, had a child, and then in the span of a few days had her husband taken away from her forever, was then brutally assaulted, and depending on the adaptation, with a group watching might I add, and then she took arsenic, her baby was taken away from her, and she was sent to a madhouse, and then was either discharged from it or escaped. I think she would have to have escaped because discharging didn't really happen. And now she lives on the streets stressing about where she's going to find her next meal, all while trying to cope with her new arsenic and trauma-induced disabilities. Now, as somebody who has dealt with actual brain damage and severe trauma at the exact same time, there is literally no way to tell what is what or where everything comes from. And I had medical words for it. We sort of know what happened. Not at the time, but like within a year of happening. So I don't know how she's coping. Like, I truly, bless her soul. Obviously, she isn't entirely coping, but she's doing better than I would. Though, to be fair, at the point we meet her, she's been doing this for probably 15, 14 years, so I guess that might... Anyway, that combination of issues, particularly knowing the profile of acute arsenic poisoning and having the stage directions mention her being at times unfocused and vacant, leads me to immediately pinpoint post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociation as an almost definitive baseline for what we are seeing in this character here. I also wanted to explore ideas of schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder with her, particularly because we see those words come up around her a lot, and also because Ruthie Ann Miles, who currently plays Lucy on Broadway, refers to her as a DID system. This is not a side of madness I know a ton about, but I did consult some system friends and friends with schizophrenia for their opinions, and here's what we managed to pull together based on textual evidence and the textual evidence alone. We'll talk about the performance evidence later. Now, first thing is that some parts of the system community feel very strongly that DID can only be developed from trauma before the age of 6 to 9. And the folks that I talked to kind of disagreed with that. I also do, because like somebody may have already been halfway there when they were younger, and then something happened later that caused things to get more defined, and symptoms didn't appear specifically clear in a certain way until later in life, despite always being there, and it could have been a full life situation. Also, many mental illnesses are changed and impacted as a person goes through puberty, etc. Also, there's a discussion to be had about how much overlap there is between the DID experience and the schizophrenia experience in regards to dissociation and hearing voices and learning to handle them, which means that those experiences are a lot closer and more intertwined and messy and blurry than the clear-cut, distinct diagnostic labels that we like to think of them as. And also, again, over half of the people with one mental disorder will be diagnosed with a second or third in their lifetime, and a third of people with one mental disorder will be diagnosed with 4 or more. So everybody's really intertwined and complicated and messy because that's just how our diagnostic system works. The other thing to note is that in the text, her switches are between only 2 distinct things, begging for alms and soliciting herself for sex work. DID systems can have only 2 personality states, but everybody that I know has several, and I would also argue that her behavior feels more indicative of her being trained, that she's only worthy and worth taking care of if she is a pitiful beggar woman or if she is a sex object, and the amount of attention a man pays to her depends on how she acts toward them. If you notice, she really only solicits Antony after he's paid her a coin, and in most productions, he stares at her after paying said coin, so she could respond to that and go, oh, he's paying more attention to me, I should try to do the thing that would get me more money, right? I would argue that we only ever see her real personality in 2 places. The first is when she is at Mrs. Lovett's pie shop, and Lovett says, how many times have I told you I will not have trash from the gutter hanging around my establishment? She responds, not just a penny, dear, or a pie, one of them pies that gives stomach cramps to half the neighborhood. Laughs, come on dear, have a heart dear. And Lovett says, off with you or you'll get a kick on the rump that'll make your teeth chatter. And then Lucy says, stuck up thing, you and your fancy airs, and then shuffles off doing her alms for a desperate woman cry. Also, when we see her doing her alms, she's doing it into the general void. She's hoping that somebody anywhere will respond, and if she knows the person who interacts with her, she stops and she behaves quite differently. Another example being when she tells Antony about the judge's house. And the other time that we see her at her true self, I would argue, is the barbershop scene at the end, which we'll touch on in just a moment. So the question is, yes, we see several different sides of her that she seems to switch fairly evenly between, but that does feel a bit to me like comparing somebody's customer service voice with their normal voice and saying that they have 2 different personalities. All people, whether DID is involved or not, have multiple facets to themselves and sides of themselves, and we know that trauma, especially dissociative trauma, can make those sides more distinctly different, and amnesia in between, whether that's dissociated trauma or DID or OSDD or something else. It's really hard to tell, and I think in this instance specifically, we really don't have enough information to be able to make any concrete judgment about pretty much anything based on the text alone. I'm literally just spitballing ideas and concepts, which again, I kind of love that she's just madness soup. Like, you could argue that maybe she's just not written very well or with enough depth or with enough care, and that's why this is the case, but I'm not gonna argue that because I think this is fascinating and so fun and interesting to work with, and also makes it age really well. Because for me, trying to analyze this has been a really great case study into how flawed our supposedly logical DSM diagnoses are, and how much every single diagnosis is intertwined with others, and how subjective concepts of madness really are, and how much the world around us and how we interact with that world impacts not only our mental state and how we behave towards others, but also how that behavior is perceived and then therefore pathologized. It's fantastic. There are so many characters in this show, many of whom we're going to talk about, where the question is this madness, or are they just traumatized, or did their trauma cause their madness, and is a traumatized person inherently mad? And tying back to the original message, how Prince was trying to go for in the original production, that's the point he wanted to make, and it aged so well is what I'm trying to like freak out over. I'm just, I don't even have words. I love this so much. There's also something important, I think, about the fact that the only 2 characters who truly figure out what is going on with Sweeney and Lovett are the 2 clearly disabled characters, both of whom try to alert people that there's something wrong and something needs to be done about it and are ignored. In Toby's case, because he tells Mrs. Lovett, who decides to lock him in the basement, and in Lucy's case, because she's a mad woman and so consistently nobody listens to what she has to say, which then adds to the discussion of whether her 2 states toward people are deliberately to get what she wants or needs out of them, rather than to actually communicate or show the kind of person that she is, because she has learned that nobody cares if she tries to do that. The barbershop scene at the end is the most heartbreaking to me, because we see her walk into this place, have a full flashback to what it used to look like, completely dissociate and forget what she was initially there for, and then starts up the routine that she used to have before everything terrible happened to her, which in combination to the stress she must be feeling at trying to warn people of legitimate danger from a woman she does not trust and definitely has or had a weird relationship with, that can be speculated upon, but just being consistently ignored for trying to do that, it just feels like that is her full mental break. I feel like almost every single principal character in the show has a distinct mental break in the script, and that is kind of where hers is. Now, speaking of Lovett and Lucy's old habits, the song Poor Thing, where Lovett tells Sweeney the story of the barber and his wife who used to live upstairs, also tells us a lot about who Lucy was beforehand, before the onset of whatever we are seeing of her in this production. Particularly that she was very naive and pure and foolish, and based on energy alone seems very easily overwhelmed and probably does not go out often. Otherwise the Judge or Beadle probably would have just like kidnapped her off the street or something like that. There's also the insinuation that she missed social cues, i.e. she didn't notice that the judge had eyes for her and she kept to herself. It may also be the case that she knew what was happening and tried to ignore it for safety, but either way this to me feels indicative of literally anything in the neurodivergence category, which would then make her more primed to have a much larger mental physiological response to her trauma that manifests itself as mental and physical disability that we see in her when we actually meet the character in the show. I also feel like there must be some sort of genetic component going on here, given Joanna's behavior and how she interacts with the world, particularly because she did not grow up with either parent, both of whom are mad, which we will argue in this video, which in some semblance, like, mental illness is genetic, but also parents teach their children how they interact with the world, and she didn't have that, and yet she shows very similar traits. Or it could all be completely situational and just based on trauma. Who knows? That's why this is fun. Are you having fun? I'm having fun. I hope you're having fun. Now, in the original play, there's no madness to be found with her. It doesn't exist. And also she doesn't, as a character, exist until the original play. I would argue that she is by some semblance, if you remember from the original text, there was Jarvis Williams, I believe that was his name. Jarvis Williams, who was the homeless man who worked for Mrs. Lovett. I would argue that she is some sort of bastardization of that character at this point. I think that's where her origins come from. But he's not mad when we meet him either. In the original Christopher Bond play, Lovett refers to her as, quote, a brainless creature, but that's in reference to her thinking that Lucy should have just gotten over herself and let the judge have her. So I'm not going to use that quote to explain mental state, because I think she's very brainful in not agreeing to do that. Lucy literally goes to the pie shop, talks to Tobias, and goes, hey, who's the barber? Interesting. So your master disappeared when he was here? That's weird. This place smells really bad. I think it might be the cellars. Also, maybe don't eat those pies. I don't trust him. And then she tries to stop a man from going to get a shave. It's the same thought process that I'm quite sure she goes through in the musical. We can watch it happen, but in the musical it's deliberately muddled so that you only know that what she's saying is legitimately a concern because you know that Sweeney's a murderer, and if you heard it out of context you would think that she's just a mad woman raving about something or other, which I think is very well crafted. Now, the one thing I do find interesting about the play is that in the asylum, Fogg has this whole monologue about madness, and he says, who is maddest, he who's shut away or he who puts him there? What more unnatural act is there to deny a fellow creature air and light? Why, sir, it is the act of a cruel and desperate lunatic. And when Anthony's like, okay, but you kind of run this place, so are you saying that you're mad? He confirms that he is therefore the maddest man in the asylum. And I think that he's correct. It did feel a bit out of place as a monologue in the actual narrative, like, when you're watching a show and somebody aggressively explains their entire minority identity in a full little essay to try to prove to everybody watching that the showrunners knew what they were doing, and it's arguably like, great, it's well written, but does it make sense within the story existing? Not super really, and it feels out of place. Great example of that being half of the monologues in Tim Burton's Wednesday, the Netflix show. We'll complain about Tim Burton later. Now, aside from the 2023 production, the original production was my favorite version of The Beggar Woman. The first and most heartbreaking thing is that they had her carrying around lots of things. She was like collecting objects. And one of the things was like a muddied, semi-broken baby doll that she often held and bounced like it was a real baby, which is absolutely heartbreaking, and shout out to whoever came up with that idea. Oh my gosh, like, oh my gosh, I like, so well done. I understood why they've taken that out in later versions because it does give a little bit more of a hint to her identity, but it's very heartbreaking. They also had her pocket for hiding her coins be under her skirts, which is also historically accurate. So when Antony gave her money, she lifted her skirt to put it in the pocket, and then Antony stared at her, which then launched her into soliciting him, which I thought was quite clever of them to like organize that transition of like, oh, she's doing this physical behavior, so her brain is assuming that's what her next step is. I also cannot entirely explain why, but this version of Lucy was most clearly inspired by real people. Mary Louise, was not trying to act like what she thought mad people looked like. She was embodying people that she had interacted with or seen or been around for significant amounts of time. The first revival was Sue Ellen Esty, and her Beggar Woman felt the opposite of the original, if that makes any sense. It felt like she'd never actually seen a mad person before and was sort of putting on a show of what she was taught madness looked like in theater class or saw in movies rather than being a real person. This version felt to me a little bit more palatable, for lack of a better word, like a mad old lady in the way that the crone from Cinderella who turns into the fairy godmother is a mad old lady. One could argue that she was just falling back into the operatic archetype of the witch, which I think is really clearly exemplified by her performance, rather than somebody that you might run into on the street on the way to the theater, which I think is a very interesting take on the character. It did feel like it robbed Lucy of a bit of her humanity and her pain and her rawness, if that makes any sense. It felt more otherworldly. So she was out of place in the way that she's always out of place, but in a less raw human way. The John Doyle revival version, played by Deanna DiMarzio, also felt less human, but in more of a constantly screaming sort of way. She felt more caricatured and objectified, but in more of a dark, spooky way than in the Circle in the Square revival, where she was more like mischievous, magical. Also not my favorite. I didn't love this adaptation in general. It felt very just consistently dark. We'll talk about that later. I feel like I keep saying we're going to talk about things later throughout this entire video, and I'm definitely going to forget something that I said I was going to talk about later and then not talk about it. Whatever. Anywho, next we have the movie. She was played by Laura Michelle Kelly. They scrubbed her clean of any of the interesting things about her character in the writing lovingly. Like, they cut her switches, they cut most of her major moments. She just feels like a random houseless woman who appears like 3 times on screen, and then oops, she was the wife the whole time. Whoa! And also, because there's no ensemble in this show, so you only ever actually meet like 5 people, you can totally tell what her purpose is. You're like, you wouldn't meet her if there wasn't a twist with her involved, you know? Like, it just kind of, I don't know, it felt like the mystery was broken a little bit. Also in Act 2, during her City on Fire piece of the Joanna sequence, she sings her anxieties about what she's witnessing to herself, and very like beautifully and prettily, rather than say trying to warn people that somebody is murdering and burning people, which is the primary point of why she's in the song to begin with. I can't majorly assess her madness in this adaptation because they got rid of it, but the madhouse scene was just odd and dehumanizing, and I didn't particularly love it. Then we have the current Broadway version, played by Ruthie Ann Miles. She did her research. You can tell. Oh my gosh. The first time I saw her, I could tell she'd done her research, and the second time I saw it with the added context of how little the script gave her to work with made me... I cried. I cried several times just realizing how much thought and care she put into this character. We're gonna start with an interview with her about the character from the Sweeney Todd TikTok account, and then we'll talk about it from there.
My name is Ruthie Ann Miles, and I play the system called the Beggar Woman. The Beggar Woman is navigating how to survive after tremendous trauma, and now she's finding that after a time of stability, suddenly her world is rocking again and she doesn't know how to adjust. I think Sweeney Todd warns of what can happen if we look past a person. We don't look at the person. We can be swept aside. We need to be taking care of each other, and I think that's what Sweeney Todd is talking about.
Now, what I love about her version of Lucy is how gentle she is. She feels a bit like a caged tiger who is generally quite soft, but also lost and lonely, and when threatened, lashes out. It felt like her brain and body were constantly humming. She was taking in tons of information, trying to figure out what to do with that information, and then also at the same time focusing on her default alms to try to get money to survive, but not actually paying attention to the fact that she was doing that because her mind is completely elsewhere. She has a sort of magnetism on the stage that I can't really explain, but I think that's interesting because on stage we see this mad houseless person and feel completely connected to her, and we want to look at her while we deliberately look away from everybody that we see on the street in real life. Something freak show doesn't necessarily mean that we're more accepting of disabled people in the real world. Not necessarily that here, but I do think it's an interesting thing to bring up in that we're okay with seeing things on stage when we're at a safe distance from it and we know how to interact with it, but then we get into the real world and see those things next to us, and then we have to interact with it, and then we suddenly ignore it and don't care about it, you know? Anyway, Ruthie went the DID route with this character, which I was skeptical about at first, especially given the discussion we had earlier about the text, and also the legacy of portrayals of DID in media. That's more what I was concerned about. I don't know why I didn't mention that there. But at the end of the day, madness is soupy, and there isn't a ton of textual information about what's going on, so you can kind of do whatever you want with her as long as you're deliberate about it and ethical about it, and you fill in the gaps of performance in such a way to support that decision. And I was like, well, hope that she does that. And she did. She totally did. Oh my gosh, did she. I was not specifically counting how many different alters she had. I think it was at least 4. It may have been more than that. And also some reappeared and others did not reappear. She seemed to correlate specific alters with specific situations. In the middle of Act 2, when she is trying to alert people about the whole city on fire thing, she is in clear distress and she switches several times. Generally, the more stress she was under, the more that she switched. And her switches were like one version of her, a pause, and then a complete change of accent, physicality, and voice quality. And yes, she switches when the script had them in the music, those like 2 or 3 times. It happens in the entire show. But she added so many more throughout the rest of her performance to help those few moments make more sense contextually and craft a full character around what she had to work with. Also, in regards to presenting her madness as schizophrenia and or DID, there's nothing in the text or stage directions to indicate that Lucy ever hears voices, which is kind of a hallmark trait of both of those. And Ruthie added that. There's a moment where she stands and has a whole conversation with the air, and it's great. From a staging perspective, during the city on fire scene, they deliberately had the non-mad population walking all together in a machine-like zombie-esque way. Meanwhile, she's weaving in between them to try to get her attention as the only awake and conscious person as to what is going on, kind of flipping the traditional narrative script a bit, which also, like, that to me mirrored modern adaptations of religious stories where a prophet or something, somebody who's hearing the word of God or whatever, will be trying to alert people but nobody listens to them and yet they end up being right in the end. I don't think that was deliberate either in writing or in this particular staging of it. Like, yes, she has some sort of saintly qualities and she can see things others cannot, but that's because she's smart and intuitive and paying attention to when things are changing around her, not that she's magical. And I still think it's interesting media analysis parallel to point out for me that I was fascinated by that. I'm analyzing a religious thing for next month's autism reviews, and I've been thinking about religious dramaturgy and how interesting it is to play with those kinds of things. Anyway, in the barbershop scene at the end where she cradles her imaginary baby, she didn't seem to switch, but rather just hit a trauma wall so hard she completely dissociated and disconnected from her physical self. And it is so vulnerable in a way that she isn't in the rest of the show. And then seeing Sweeney walk in and completely shatter that, which if you've never had somebody violently drag you out of a dissociative episode, I hope you never have to experience that because it's absolutely terrifying. Just like, it's so heartbreaking, and then right when she's trying to get her bearings and figure out what's going on, he kills her. And this is the only version where I have cried at Lucy's death, and I did both times. It just stunning work by everybody involved. I will say that DID is not my lived experience, so technically what I have to say on the portrayal doesn't majorly matter, but I have not seen any systems directly talk about the portrayal other than some expressing concern about how it would be portrayed when they heard about it as a concept. But as a media analyst, I add another syllable to that. As a media analyst who has seen the history and legacy of DID in media, I don't even have words for how wonderful and important this is. And also unheard of in the media. Like all media. Like normally I separate film media from theater media because they have a completely different history of sorts in how we portray things. But yeah, I don't have words, is what I'm saying, and you can tell that by how I'm acting right now. Now, in regards to underestimated disabled characters who are the first to figure out what's happening, not because their disabilities make them magical or able to read minds, but because they really like to understand the world around them in its entirety in order to feel safe within it, our next character is Tobias, whose legacy is very complicated in a very different way. Now, every time I try to bring him up as developmentally disabled in conversation, I have been told that it is just because, oh, he's a young boy character who's historically played by young adult men, and so he comes across as childish in a slightly caricatured way because of that, which does play a part in it, not arguing that, but I do think it's a lot more to it than that. First of all, because he's consistently referred to as simple and a simpleton throughout the entire thing, and second of all, we have young adults playing adolescent characters on Broadway literally all the time. Their characters do not default disabled the vast majority of the time, so that is a thing to notice, but that correlation has nothing to do with the actual portrayal of this character. Now, throughout the text, Tobias is continuously infantilized, particularly by Mrs. Lovett, who refers to him as simple 2 separate times. I will say that contextually, the first time she calls him simple, she may be referencing the fact that he is slightly intoxicated, and the second time she calls him that is simply as a cover-up to tell the beadle why she's locked him in the bakehouse. But just because they can calm a drunk Tobias down with a badly phrased story about where Pirelli's gone doesn't mean that it'll also work when he's sober, so that simpleness categorization would carry over. And then the second time, Lovett comes up with that excuse way too quickly for the thought of what a simple little boy to not already have been in her mind as a descriptor during her last interaction with Tobias. And the beetle, who has met Tobias several times before, seems to easily agree to this explanation, implying that this explanation of Toby's mental state checks out to him. And also there's a stage direction elsewhere where he is described as adolescent and simple-minded, which is obviously more objective than any line in a script will be, but either way, yeah. Mrs. Lovett also refers to Toby as it several times, which according to the Oxford English Dictionary was commonly used to refer to young children, a specific line being, "Oh, what a sweet child it is," which could very well be an older person seeing a 16-year-old and thinking of him as a baby, because that's just a thing that happens. But also all of this feels a little bit too deliberate, and the fact that I'm trying to explain away 4 different explanations of him being disabled as not being the precise meaning that those words actually have feels like a crucial thing to point out. Like, I'm like explaining away all of the evidence that we have and doing it poorly. So the next question is whether Tobias is developmentally disabled or just very traumatized and stunted because of how poorly Pirelli treats him, but then that brings us back into the whole madness is soup category, especially because complex PTSD and autism can often be somewhat indistinguishable from each other. And either way, that would technically be madness, and either way look like developmental disability. Also, given how quickly Tobias has a full mental break at the end in the bakehouse, that whole end sequence only happens over the span of maximum a few hours. Like, it's not that long, means he was definitely primed for it on some level. Now, looking at the text, there is something to be said about the fact that the relationship between Pirelli and Tobias can be perceived in 2 different ways. The first being abject horror, where Pirelli uses Tobias as an objectified servant and regularly kicks and slaps him. The second is a comedic master-servant relationship. Specifically in this case, I would argue them as a Capitano-Zani pairing, with the Zani being fairly unintelligent and the antics of Capitano pushing him around, being deliberately over the top and comedic. The recent project I was a disability dramaturg on was a Shakespeare comedy where we had extensive conversations about whether there was actual inter-character abuse happening or whether it was a lazzo or a physical gag, and I feel like that's kind of pretty fuzzy here as well. And it depends on the adaptation that you watch which choice the director has chosen, because I've seen both. However, if you interpret it tragically, this leads us to a fundamentally traumatized and hurt Tobias. If you interpret it comically, this leads us to a clown-esque Tobias, and like we talked about in part 1, clown was initially just non-disabled mimicry of developmentally and intellectually disabled court jesters, so that actually also leads us with a default disabled Tobias in either direction we look at it from. From a directorial perspective, I think that one can toe the line between the horrific and the comedic very well here. The entire show kind of walks that line, honestly. But either way, it doesn't really change the character all that much, and whether his developmental disability is a result of his surroundings, i.e. people taking advantage of him, or something that he was born with that led people to take advantage of him, that led him to the surroundings he is in, either way, we really just can't majorly deny this characterization. And again, sticking with the theme of this show does a wonderful job vagifying the line between mad and sane, another fascinating way of handling it. In the original production, played by Ken Jennings, we first meet Tobias somewhat costumed like a circus monkey, with a red vest and a little drum on a string around his neck. This Tobias also moves slightly slowly, like someone who easily stumbles and needs to carefully watch their step at times. He also did a lot of the 2-second eye contact, 4-second look away, and then eye contact, like this situation. That happened a lot, and also at the end, pat a cake monologue, it felt somewhat similar to the beggar woman in the barbershop, where you saw a thin layer of character that you've known all along running underneath this deeply broken and vulnerable person that you're seeing before you, which was very interesting. Now, in comparison, in the first revival, played by Eddie Corbett, he felt less disabled than the original, particularly with how he moved and he made eye contact, but then in the end scene, he had the stims and the vocal cadence of madness absolutely solid. Oh my gosh, it was so good, which made this descent into madness in the bakehouse feel much more extreme and irreversible than the original. The John Doyle revival, we had Manuel Feliciano, and his Tobias felt very disabled. He stood with a hunch, he moved his hands and his fingers a lot, he often walked with T-Rex arms. If you're not familiar with T-Rex arms, they're a common sign of hypermobility because holding your arms like a T-Rex is the most comfortable with your elbows at your waist. I've been doing that the whole video and I just realized it. We see it a lot in ADHD and autistic folks, but he's overall kind of floppy with his movement, which implies some semblance of developmental disabilities and what is not physio developmental disabilities, things like dyspraxia, often come hand in hand. At the same time, this also could have been a deliberate desire to make him look like a child rather than a disabled adult, particularly because his costuming looked kind of like Michael Darling from Peter Pan. That's unclear to me, but at the end they did tie him up in a full straitjacket and gag him. So that, there was that. In the film, he was an actual child, played by an actual child. They cut the pat a cake bit at the end, and also seeing a child kill a man is horrible. We lost a lot of the disability in the film, which again is so interesting to me because Tim Burton is autistic. So we'll get to the adaptation analysis soon, I promise. In the 2023 version, I saw Daniel Marconi both times. I've also seen clips of Gaten Matarazzo, who is the original and also is a disabled person. I couldn't track down if that's the language he uses for himself, so apologies if that's incorrect, but he does have a rare disease, so categorically. Obviously, disabilities, not interchangeable things, but having a disability as part of one's lived experience will impact how a person approaches any character that they play on some level, so that also just feels important to note. From what I've seen of Gaten's Toby on the interwebs, his is definitely noticeably slow in regards to physical speed and mental processing speed. He also did a lot of the short eye contact look away thing. Marconi's, the one that I saw, definitely felt less disabled than Gaten's, but still had the T-Rex arms, he still toddled, he was always a few steps behind Lovett, and he used his hands to over-accentuate what he says. Gaten also does that. For me, that feels very much like a sort of coping mechanism for somebody's words not being understood, which could imply some semblance of a communication disorder or communication issues in his life. And also communication disorder would tie in to the overarching hypermobility potentially, which would tie into the T-Rex arms and developmental disability conglomerate of diagnoses that I feel like makes a lot of sense here. Broadway's Next Tobias, which it starts tonight. I think he starts tonight. Congratulations on your Broadway debut. Is played by Joe Locke. Yeah, I'm seeing the show again this weekend with a different Sweeney and a different Lovett and Joe as Tobias. So I will add a pinned comment below after I see it Sunday night probably or Monday morning to let you know where their portrayals fell within this whole analysis as well after I see it. But what's interesting to me is that Joe recently did an interview with the New York Times where he said, the easiest way to play him is that he's a bit simple. He's not a full egg, as the Irish would say, Locke said in a phone conversation in early January from his Manhattan apartment before one of his first rehearsals. But I think he's a very street smart character who survived in a world where people like him shouldn't survive. That, to me, implies that we will not be getting a traditionally simple Toby, but then at the same time, the text does create constraints for that. So I'm very excited to see what he does with this portrayal and what we're going to see from that. Next is Joanna, who has the exact opposite problem of that. She does not have a lot of text to work with. She's a bit of what I call a canvas character, i.e. she exists for other people to paint upon. I do have a series about, I need to get back to this series actually, I forgot about it. It's about how most, if not all, Disney princesses are canvas characters and how that makes them very autistic coded because extensive masking often makes one a canvas person. Also, a lot of Disney princesses are originated on tales by autistic people, which is where that series initially started, but anyway. I described this character type of a canvas character as smart, quick-witted, and a go-getter who doesn't really fit into social norms, but at the same time people can't get too mad at her because she is generic kind human who happens to be friends with anybody and everything, even random animals, which I just described Joanna. Those are her character traits. Wow, amazing. We love how tropes carry over. She also exists right on the line between is this trauma or is this madness, but then, yet again, everybody is traumatized on some level in life in general because life is traumatizing and most madness is categorized by naming the unproductive trauma responses. For example, she is singing all of the time and it seems implied that this is how she self-soothes, how she spends all of her lonely time, but that is also a stim. Singing all the time is a stim. Her only friends are birds and she doesn't really know how to interact with people because she's locked in her room all the time, not necessarily because she is autistic or something else, but then at the same time, those would both present fairly identically in the situations that we see her in, so at the end of the day, does it really matter? Also, her brain is always working a million miles a minute. She's constantly planning for the worst possible thing to happen, trying to account for absolutely every single outcome of everything, and she's constantly mentally and or physically moving, like flitting about like the bird that she loves to watch. I didn't take a lot of notes about the various Joannas throughout history because she's a canvas character. I wasn't majorly paying attention to her. I didn't really think about including her in this analysis until I saw the 2023 version the second time and was so deeply surprised by how much they gave her via the staging and wasn't able to go back to compare that against earlier versions because I ran out of time. That's on me. But since I've shouted out all the other principal actors in this, original cast was Sarah Rice. She very recently passed away. In 1989 we had Gretchen Kingsley, 2005 we had Lauren Molina, and then in 2023 Joanna is played by Maria Bilbao, and they took the idea of her being a caged bird, and they ran with it. They made her move and flit about like the birds that she watches out of her window. She is always in motion, tapping herself, rubbing her face, playing with her hands, standing, sitting. Her panic stim is whacking herself on the forehead like this with her wrist, and anytime she tries to do more, quote, typical movement, such as waving at others or sitting down normally, it is always really sharp and slightly awkward and uncontrolled, which makes her character so much more captivating and interesting to watch. But also, since they have Maria play Lucy during the earlier scenes, it makes you connect Joanna's behavior to that of a young Lucy, making you more understanding of why Lucy got so overwhelmed and easily taken advantage of and wasn't able to cope with that fact. And then the second time around, when I knew who the beggar woman was, Lucy's behavior starts to feel almost like an aged up and more darkened version of her daughter, so you feel almost like Joanna needs to be saved as she is still this bright, fluffy, bouncy person in comparison to this dark, broken, equally in motion, but in a different way kind of person. It makes you feel for both of them so much more. So let this be a lesson that just what you do with physicality changes so much about how a character is read from the outside. But this leaves us to our final two characters, Mrs. Lovett and Sweeney Todd. The discussion of them over adaptations worked best when comparing them as a pair, so we're gonna do textural characteristics and then we'll go through them as a unit. So Lovett, very chaotic. Based on the text and music alone, chaotic, disorganized, ever-changing, kind of in her own little world with a brain full of thoughts that popcorn from one to the other. But then, at the same time, she has an underlying goal that, depending on the Lovett, she either calculates through the entire time or just kind of stumbles into it accidentally and rolls with it. She's often described by people as kooky and bonkers. Sweeney, on the other hand, is obscenely controlled and precise and thought out with something more sinister bubbling underneath. There's this paper I read for this video that I did not end up really tying into it majorly called Mayhem and Morality in Sweeney Todd by Alfred Mullen, about themes of madness in the score specifically, and it reflected how chaotic and all over the place Mrs. Lovett's score was, but chaotic with fluidity in comparison to the beggar woman's having sharp changes to be unsettling. Meanwhile, Sweeney's is very precise and the rhyming couplets are spaced very far apart from each other, which emphasize his forethought and his planning. And that you know he's truly gone off the deep end once you get to the point where his actions and his music no longer match up, i.e. in Joanna Quartet, where he is singing beautiful, lovely music while actively slitting people's throats. There's also several lines alluding to the fact that Sweeney heard music that nobody heard, referencing that behind the eyes he is a calculated machine planning his next move. I think you could analyze that to mean that he also has some sort of madness in reference to hearing voices, but I don't think that I don't know. I've seen the analysis of that line come up from the original team as being the first meaning in reference to him being a constantly whirring machine, so that's the one that I'm inclined to keep working with. There is some argument to be made to say that he is fully aware of what Lovett wants from him and he's twisting that to get what he wants from her, but I would also argue that they're both just using each other for their various desires, and I think they're both deeply selfish people sitting and brooding on the things that they want and not really paying attention to what the other is feeling or experiencing, but this also very much depends on the pair. Sweeney is often described as sociopathic. I take major issue with that term and how it is thrown around, much like how we throw around the term narcissist these days. Please do not use it ever if you can. Which you can. You don't need to use it. I'm just using it to illustrate that people do associate him with mental illness. Now, there's something to be said about the fact that we see villains or people doing bad things as inherently mentally ill to justify to ourselves that there is a clean line between people who do good things and people who do bad things, and that actually we'd be able to figure out who they are and save ourselves before anything bad happens to us. This is a human survival mechanism. It makes sense, but it's also a problematic one in regards to how it leads us to treat disabled people and use disability words. And it also puts us in more danger because if you think that everybody's inherently bad or good and you're looking for outside things on like, oh, they must be a bad person and they must be a good person, you often end up with the wrong answers. And also everybody is complicated and in the gray areas, and most everybody thinks that they're doing the right thing. Like I say this time and time again, the majority of abusers do not mean to abuse people. It's just how they think human interaction is supposed to work or how they can get what they want. And in this case, the ending of the show being an acknowledgement that a Sweeney Todd could be anywhere, you could be sitting next to him and not realize it, kind of reflects this ideology, but just because it's in the show does not mean that people necessarily internalize it or internalize it as the message of the show. So let's talk about our Sweeney Sweeney Lovett pairings. The original production was Len Cariou and Angela Lansbury. Again, if I butchered anybody's name in this, I'm so sorry. I tried to look all of them up, but I couldn't necessarily find answers for everybody. First of all, Angela Lansbury, hilarious. I found the 2023 Lovetts to be funnier because they just added more bits in the way that they staged it, but she is the funniest by far of all the other Broadway versions. Sometimes Len would be like going on and on and on about something, and she would just be standing there bopping by herself. She's just like standing there, just vibing. Moving on, no thoughts, only vibes. I loved it, delightful. Not a lot behind her eyes. Overall, the pair looked a bit larger than life, a bit off-putting from the moment you met them, but they had an underlying warmth to them that made them feel very human, but also just like erratic. You didn't know what their next move was. In the 1989 revival, Bob Gunton Sweeney looks like a regular guy. Like, could easily be somebody's dad. When he shows up, he's a bit lost, he's a bit spacey, he's trying to get his bearings, and he defaults in general to showing no emotion until he can decide which emotion he wants to show, and then he expresses said emotion. Unless he can't hold in it anymore, in which case he explodes. But his eyes give everything away. You could see that man's gears turn as he watched and waited and planned, moving slowly and sluggishly and methodically through absolutely everything that he did. Beth Fowler's Mrs. Lovett was a little kooky, but also had way too much going on behind the eyes. She felt super evil and calculated and was trying to cover that up by being really loud and chaotic so nobody would suspect her. And the only time I really saw that crack was during Epiphany, when Gunton's deeply broken and hurt and human Sweeney completely broke and she panicked and grabbed a knife to try to protect herself from him. But otherwise, she was very in control of things to a very calculated degree. In the 2005 revival, Michael Cerverus and Patti LuPone, they both felt super evil from the beginning without any warmth at all. Like, I firmly believed that, like, they used to kill squirrels and commit small arson when they were growing up. Also, neither of them were British. If I remember correctly, all of the pairs beforehand were a British Lovett and an American Sweeney. During Epiphany, he tried to strangle Lovett, and then the immediate transition from that to A Little Priest, where they were very horny towards each other, was a narrative experience. I kind of liked the extremes and tone shift there that it went to, because it made A Little Priest feel very dark and off-putting and unhinged. But I also feel like that transition was the most extremes of the two emotions that they had in the show. The rest of it felt pretty, like, just spooky the whole time. The movie was... Let's just say that the fact that what we know now about Johnny Depp does not make this age very well. Don't get me wrong, his Sweeney, terrifying, but I don't think they initially meant it to be as scary as it currently is and in the way that it currently is. He played Sweeney British. This is where I learned that I don't like British Sweeneys. I think it's weird. Also, Bonham Carter's Lovett was very creepy and calculated. The film didn't really have the arc of broken man turned killer with the aid of a lady who's into him, and more, wow, we really want to kill some people. This is a fun horror movie. Also, there's one part where Depp, like, grabbed his razor in public when he saw the Beetle and just, like, wanted to murder him in public, but then stopped himself. And I don't think the traditional Sondheim Sweeney would be so careless as to even clue in that he might want to murder somebody in public like that. Generally, Depp Sweeney's murders were as violent as possible. He stabbed Pirelli like 15 times and, like, screaming. Also, during Epiphany, he put Lovett into the chair and held a blade up to her neck. It was a lot. There was a lot going on. Lastly, we have the two different Sweeney Lovett pairs from the current Broadway production that I have seen thus far. The first pair is Josh Groban and Annalee Ashford. Annalee's Lovett feels like organized chaos with a lot going on behind the eyes, but by a lot, I do mean several different colors of heart emojis, and that's it. Nothing else. And if she has to be an accomplice to a murderer to get her man, that's fine by her. She'll figure it out. She'll sort it. It's all good. This Lovett is very deeply horny, and it is hilarious. I'm obsessed with it. Meanwhile, Groban Sweeney was frustrated and sad rather than angry and easily yelling. Like, he was just kind of stewing. There was something humming to the point where, like, Lovett never knew what his next move was. She was just trying to balance it out to try to get him to love her in any way that she possibly could to get what she wants. And I think a really great moment to exemplify this is at the end at the bakehouse when they're dancing together. The look on her face wasn't terror, and that she didn't seem to know that he was going to put her in the furnace. She was watching him carefully, anxiously, trying to figure out where he was going and how she could try to complement that and counteract that for them both to get what they wanted out of the situation. Now, what I love about this Sweeney Lovett pair is that they really exemplify the I'd never have guessed it was them of it all. Like, they're charming and they're kind and they're funny and they're fun and seemingly completely normal people who just happened to be serial killers. And you kind of understood the arc that they took to get to where they were. You were almost rooting for Sweeney when he killed the first person, and then you were like, wait, what? Hello? What's going on? They were just so human about it all. And they were also the traditional British Lovett, American Sweeney. The second pair that I saw were just as human in a different way. It was Nicholas Christopher and Delaney Westfall, with both of them being British. They were so spooky. Oh my gosh, they were so spooky. It was great. Nicholas started out very similar to Groban's and being kind of broody and quiet, though he did get to a higher level of anger than Groban ever did, really. And then during Epiphany, he had a full and complete mental break, like crawling on the floor, giggling, losing it. And while Annalise Lovett had her hands up like this and wasn't sure with what like Groban was going to do to her during Epiphany, Delaney was just watching Nicholas carefully, not with fear, but with concern, trying to figure out what was going on with him and how she could handle it. And at the end of it, she tries to speak to him and he's completely disconnected. Like this man just like, boop, brain gone, that was the end of that. So when it came to A Little Priest, her tone felt kind of like a parent trying to quiet a screaming toddler in the supermarket, but then like halfway through the song, she sort of broke, was like, LOL, this is what we're doing now. And they were just like giggling about baking people into pies in a way that was so detached from reality as to be both fun and campy, but also absolutely terrifying. And then in Act 2, Nicholas was fully like giddy while killing people during Joanna. His Sweeney had such a wide range of emotions that he covered that it made him seem deeply unstable and unsettling, and I loved it. Delaney's Lovett felt a bit like a cross between the first two Lovetts in that she was more aware of what was going on and was calculated about it, but in a light, fluffy, fun way that wasn't super dark and scary, and not always on the same track as Sweeney, but trying her hardest to be. Like she was always like a step behind, but she was trying to figure it out. There was something darker and a bit sharper about her Lovett than Annalise, but it was not as dark as the second, the circle in the square Lovett. Going back to the bakehouse scene to describe them as well, Delaney's Mrs. Lovett knew Sweeney was going to throw her into that furnace from the moment he made physical contact with her, and she was trying to push him and derail it and get out of that situation, which was very interesting. But what I found most fascinating about this pair was getting to see how much wiggle room they had under the same direction, and how both pairs get the similar message across in line with the directorial intent of the show, but go about it completely different. So I'm very excited to see a third pair this weekend. I'm like collecting Sweeney Todd's like Pokemon cards. I'm just so deeply fascinated by how oddly specific and yet super vague this text is. Like it gives you so much freedom. Anyway, let's talk about the different adaptations that I saw really quickly, and then let's wrap this thing up. So original production. I don't have a lot to say about this other than it's the classic. It's also very clear that the 2023 version took a lot of inspo from it, and I kind of only noted down when I was taking notes what things felt fundamentally different from the 2023 version, and I didn't have a lot of notes here because it didn't feel super different. Judge Turpin and Pirelli were made a lot darker, as if they were the villains of the story, which I thought was interesting, particularly with how the judge treated and touched Joanna. Like, they almost insinuated that he had already done things to her. And then at the end of this one, Len Sweeney lifted up his head waiting for Tobias to kill him, which was such an interesting choice. I also really loved getting to hear the real-time reactions of a massive audience of people who did not know anything about the story. We're kind of at a point in society now where a solid portion of any given Sweeney audience is going to know the story because it's so culturally ingrained, but seeing people cheer and scream and laugh and groan in real time for the original where they didn't know what to expect from it was really, really, really fun. My one frustration was that the ensemble was not British. Like, they sang all the ensemble numbers in American accents. Like, God, that's good. I was like, what is happening right now? It was really, really weird and off-putting. Also, Victor Garber, who played Antony's sideburns, were very, very distracting. Also, there was the factory whistle, horrifyingly loud. And I think if I had seen the show live, I would have hated it because I would have been so sensorially overwhelmed by the factory whistle. So formal thank you to the team of the current revival for choosing to only use it during City on Fire and also having it be way less loud than the original production. I appreciate you for that. The first revival was fine. I didn't find it to be super majorly different from the original, though I think it being a thrust stage rather than the proscenium would have definitely changed the experience of it in real time. Somebody audibly screamed during the judge's murder, which I thought was hilarious. I did feel like having such a foreboding and evil Lovett sort of detracted from the fun of the show, if that makes sense. I found that a lightly airheaded, silly, goofy, Off Her Rocker, Love It brings the lightness of the show that then gives you more tonal freedom to work with, because in case you haven't noticed, the show's real dark, and having the kooky fun lightness of Love It to offset that helps give it more breathing room and makes it overall a more fun and engaging time, and I think that they lost some of that here. And I also didn't love that Lucy was slightly dehumanized and more like magical-ified. It was very theatrical, it was very well performed, but I didn't have the messiness and the rawness that I think she needed to succeed as the enigma that she is, if that makes sense. Because like when we see like a magical being that just like shows up and is magical, I feel like we're all like trained from Hallmark movies at this point, like, oh, the weird guy who winks once in the marketplace is definitely, like, you kind of knew what was coming with her in a way that you didn't in the original and you don't in the 2023 version. But that was a lot of negative things. Overall, I did like this version. I think I like this version of Sweeney over the original, but I definitely wish that it was Angela's Love It and everything else the same. The second revival, the 2005 one, was very dark throughout the entire thing. The centerpiece was a giant black casket. This version felt like a fun, campy horror musical rather than a biting anti-capitalist social commentary musical that I personally look for in my Sweeney productions. It also had a very small ensemble and everybody was on stage at all times playing all the instruments, which I felt like made it harder to tell when somebody was in character or out of character or overheard something or didn't overhear something. I think it was visually really cool. The talent was off the charts. It feels like the kind of performance that you kind of need to see live to fully appreciate it. Also, Patti LuPone on the tuba is one of my favorite things to ever happen, but it definitely, it felt like in trying to simplify it, it ended up making it more muddled and unclear what was going on. And also every single song was like at a really fast tempo. The whole thing felt rushed and I was like, what is happening right now? Next we have the movie. Fundamentally, it's a different art form, so I think expecting it to be really comparable to the stage version is a fool's errand anyway, and that's on me for expecting that, but it still was definitely my least favorite of the bunch. All the intriguing disability aspects were removed, the ensemble was gone, and therefore most of the best songs. The anti-capitalism and machinery of it all was also removed, and it was also very horror-based, focusing more on the dark and the sinister and on being creepy rather than on like why these images exist in the story in the first place, if that makes any sense, which subsequently makes them feel a little bit hollow and soulless. Spooky things aren't my thing anyway, but I can handle spooky if there's a reason behind it. This show was a great example of that. So for me, this version took out all the things that would make me compelled to watch it in the first place and replaced them with more things that I don't love. Doesn't mean that it's bad, it's just not what I was looking for and it's not my genre of thing. Also, Tim Burton's style is deliberately doll-like in making people look not so much like people and more like dolls in a play world, which is cool. But again, looking at this piece through the lens of understanding how capitalism churns out broken people, having the people not look or act like people kind of undercuts its own purpose. I think part one of this, I mentioned that Sondheim had a role in this film. That wasn't entirely true. I fact-checked that. They consulted him heavily though, but he did not have a hand in it directly. But this version does seem to follow these smaller melodrama aspects of the story that Sondheim spoke about initially in wanting this show to be before Hal Prince came on board. Now, the one thing I did really love about the film, however, was the song By the Sea, because they plopped Depp and Carter into various situations she sings about in various silly costumes, and he looks like he wants to die, and it's hilarious. But overall, I felt like this one did a great job in doing precisely what it aimed to do, which was make it a horror film, but that's not what I wanted from it, if that makes sense. And I also think, like, there's so many themes of madness in this thing, and having an autistic director take out all of the themes of madness is so interesting to me, because I felt like going into it, I was like, oh, you know, this is going to be so interesting because he does have that lens. I know he's not really in Community. I know he's not super involved, but he does identify, and so I assumed that it would give us something else to work with, and then it didn't have any of it, and I was like, where to go? Where did it go? I wanted that, so I was a little bummed that there wasn't a lot for me to work with because I was expecting to get so much from it, and I just didn't. So yeah, which is also interesting because in looking at Wednesday, which is Tim Burton's most recent thing, there's a lot of madness in it. It was handled atrociously, but there was a lot of it there. Anyway, moving on. Last but certainly not least is the current production. This one, obviously, if I haven't made that clear enough, is my favorite by far. It is so much fun and it balances tone really well, giving you a neat balance between fun and silly, but also not ignoring the dark underlying all of it. Like specifically the first act does that, and then the second act just like plunges into darkness. And it's so, the first time I saw it at intermission, I was like, this is fun and it's campy and I love it and I'm having a good time, LOL murder musical. And then I got up after Act 2 and my legs were shaking. Fantastic directorial work. They also got rid of the continuous factory whistle, which initially existed deliberately to be a jump scare to let you know what you were signing up for when you got into the theater. But also jump scares usually just alienate your audience by making them needlessly anxious and unfocused, especially disabled audience members, and you don't typically achieve what you want from them. And we know that from trauma-informed training, which is the other thing that I do. So I don't know who on the creative team knows a lot about how to create trauma-informed work, or if that was deliberate, but somebody had to, because they handled all of it really well in a way that other productions have not at all, and that had to come from somewhere. So I appreciate them for that. I will say, having the only strobe or even remotely flashing lights in the entire show be during the scene in the madhouse did feel like a personal attack. But otherwise, fantastic. Though I will say, because I paid attention to this, there's only ever 2 strobes on Joanna, and then she exits and the rest of the song would have strobes in it. So technically, if Joanna were to be played by a disabled actor or actress, it would, other than that initial strobe, which she's able to stand with her back to the strobe, and can close her eyes if that's possible for that actor, that would be safe and possible if that person had a flashing light sensitivity. I pay attention to these things. I can also tell you precisely which roles in Hadestown would be accessible to some people who are photosensitive. Anyway, moving on. Other things that I loved. They choreographed the people to physically be the machinery throughout, particularly the ensemble and the people in the madhouse. I didn't catch that until the second time around, but I was freaking out. It is so genius. I didn't mention this in my script, and I forget if it's Stephen Hodgett or Stephen Hoggett, but he was the choreographer for this production, and he did the movement stuff with, oh my gosh, my brain is empty right now. This is what happens when I don't script things. He's part of Frantic Assembly, which choreographed Curious Incident. So I was so fascinated by the movement the first time that I watched this, and I was like, oh, this is so good. And then I went home and I read the playbill and I was like, oh, because I've studied this man's work for a full year, and that's why I loved it so much. But again, that kind of physical theater movement takes the place of a lot of lighting design that is inherently inaccessible and makes it just as visually entertaining to watch, and I just think that's really cool and really great. Again, I don't know how I forgot to mention this, but Sweeney Todd is one of the most accessibly staged shows we have open on Broadway right now. If you want to learn more about accessible staging, I'll link my video about that above. But the fact that they put so much effort and time into crafting visually interesting movement meant that they didn't need to have lots of flashing lights, lots of big set pieces that are shiny, lots of things that cause sensory overload, loud sound design as well. And I don't think that was deliberate, but I would also say that, like, in taking a work that is inherently dark and scary, having over-the-top lighting and sound design makes it overwhelming on several different levels, and by kind of lessening those in this production, they were able to give it more freedom for the actual work to breathe through the text and through the music, and get the audience to relax into it a bit more, which I think is trauma-informed practices, but used in a slightly different way, which also would explain the factory whistle choice as well, which again I don't think was deliberate. However, it does make this show that I expected to be fundamentally inaccessible just simply due to its topic be one of the most accessible things that we have right now open on Broadway, probably unintentionally, and I think that is so important and so crucial that we point out as well. So thank you to them for that, even though I think this was an accident, but it does line up with a lot of directorial intent and how we put together productions in general. So I think it's an interesting thing to reflect upon as well. Also genius is during Epiphany, when Sweeney is at the front of the stage waving his razor around, they put an uplight in front of him, so there's a giant Sweeney wielding weapon shadow moving behind him on the giant wall, and it is so spooky and so cool, and I lose my mind every single time it happens. Also, they had Sweeney die next to Lucy rather than on top of her, robbing him of the final image of love, which I'm kind of obsessed with as a choice. Because I've never seen all the other adaptations that I watched, he died on top of her, holding her, and it was kind of like almost a Romeo and Juliet-esque, like, oh, at least they got to die in each other's arms, when they robbed him of that, which I honestly think is almost better, I don't know. It's a very interesting choice. Also, having the slightly more subdued Sweeney Lovett pairings is, I think, my favorite thing of all of my favorite things, because it gives more of a true crime feel to the show, which honestly updates it and makes it more interesting for an audience, because we're very true crime oriented these days. But like, you don't expect people to look and act like that and then suddenly become serial killers, because these guys are fun and charming and silly, which makes their actions all the more scary and off-putting, in my opinion. And it also ties into the themes of like, the system creates people like this rather than people themselves are innately evil, which I think just served the directorial purpose very well. I also know that there was like a whole, people were complaining about accents when the show opened. I just gotta say, y'all didn't have to watch all of the other adaptations or hear God That's Good sung in American accents, because this is the best accented version that I have ever seen. Yeah, other than the film. I'm not going to count the film. The film doesn't count. I think when it comes to what I would like to see from Sweeney Productions moving forward, I feel like the current version is as close to perfect in the sense of what I would want from this work directorially as I've seen, though I would love to see more attention paid to the madness of it all, because there are great things in relation to portrayals for all 5 of these characters in the current version, but it also feels distinctly like these things are a fluke, like something just kind of happened that way, rather than deliberate work with disability in mind led by a scholar, or having a discussion like the one that we are having now. This is what disability dramaturgy looks like. Normally not, you know, how 2 hours. This video is probably going to be like 2.5 hours. I feel like the part 1 and part 2 of this video are actually going to be the length of Act 1 and Act 2 of Sweeney Todd, and I think that that's hilarious of me. They actually more or less are. Act 1 is about 90 minutes and Act 2 is just about an hour. Normally disability dramaturgy work is this much work, but then it doesn't all get explained to the actors. Anyway, I love what we currently have, but I think adding more depth, or at least intention behind it, would be really cool to see, because I felt like there were some missed opportunities. It felt like there was a little bit more to be working with in this production that they didn't choose to work with, and I don't think it would have made things more complicated or made it more muddled or more messy if they had worked with it. Also, in that vein, I created the series as a direct answer to the argument of we don't cast disabled people in things because there aren't roles for disabled people. We have always been a core part of the theater canon. We will always be. I'm just pulling these characters back out and pointing at them and going, hey, did you know this exists? So in the future, I would love to also have some disabled folks involved. I had an image pop into my brain while researching this of what a Tobias with Down syndrome would look like, and I'm kind of obsessed with it, and I need it to happen immediately. I can't get it out of my brain. I was also struck in watching the show over the course of several decades how monolithic our casting has become. Like, it used to be very white, so we've become more diverse in that sense, but we don't have character actors anymore. Everybody is completely flat and still all the time unless choreographed otherwise. When in one of the older productions, I don't remember which one, there was an actor stimming the whole show, and not like, oh, he's fidgeting with his pants, everybody does that kind of way, but like flapping his hands and going like this, like banging his wrists together at one moment, and it gave his character something extra. He felt like a person, not like a monolithic inhuman creature spit out of a conservatory program. And most humans fidget, all humans fidget, frankly, and it's always bothered me that we actively discourage that in our actors, rather than go like, how would your character fidget and how does that reflect how they're feeling, and learn how to channel that energy elsewhere, because it makes our actors look less human, and it makes our characters look less human. And seeing that we used to allow that however many years ago, but then punish it in students right now to a point where it actively traumatizes a lot of people, just really irked me, because we're missing depth from our characters that we would be able to get if we were less strict about that. But anyway, in conclusion, hire disabled actors. We rock. We make your shows more exciting. We also make up about 25% of the population, probably more. So it's about time our broadcasts reflect that. And also, I shouldn't have to feel the need to write a 27,000 word video essay to prove that or defend our right to exist in theatrical spaces. I don't think that I had to do this, but I really wanted to, and it was really fun. But anyway, I think I've talked for long enough. Believe it or not, this is only about 70 to 75% of what I learned in my research. I cut a lot of this to make it a somewhat cohesive storyline. So if you have any questions about the show or the time period or lines or anything else, feel free to drop those into the comments. I would be happy to answer them. I have nowhere else for this information to go, and I can promise you that everybody in my life is very tired of hearing me talk about Sweeney Todd. So let's talk about it in the comments. Also, being able to research this video in a way that was accessible to me, i.e. getting an accessible seat at the theater and buying the script, was very expensive. Like, probably going to be about 5 months of my YouTube AdSense to cover all of that from what I currently make. So if you do want to give this video and the first part as well an extra like, extra comment, extra subscribe to my channel, send it to all of your friends, your English and theater teachers, that's so very welcome. I feel weird being like, hey, I'm plugging my own work, but I genuinely, this was a lot of work and I would like if a lot of people got to see it. Also, if you have answers to my 2 biggest questions, which I'm going to explain in a second, please let me know in the comments. These 2 questions are, 1, how did nobody expect that maybe the random guy who appeared out of nowhere and suddenly became the best barber in London, who happened to be working in the exact space where a cursed barber who was formerly the best barber in London lived before getting shipped off to Australia and also uses the original guy's razors, might not be the same guy? He's doing this. Why did nobody... This bothers me. Like, nobody thought, I know it's been 15 years, but like, I remember things from 15 years ago when I was a child. So adults definitely. Anyway, 2, if Lovett had been honest from day 1 and Sweeney knew that Lucy was alive and he managed to get Joanna back from the judge somehow, I would assume that they would like heist her and then they would all run off to the seaside or something. What kind of father do you think that Todd would be? What do you imagine their future as a family would look like? Like, what would that alternate reality exist as? Would he still be an angry murderer, or would he become like the sweetest, most doting husband in the world? I don't know. Anyway, great. Thank you for watching this adventure of the 2 videos. This is one of the most fulfilling things I've done in a very long time. I'm very excited it's finally done, but I'm also a little sad about it. I don't know what I'm gonna do with myself. It will take me another month or 2 to do the next one of this, so don't expect more anytime soon. This is a process. But I hope that you learned something. You should definitely go see the show on Broadway right now because if you can, because it's just fantastic. Also, with the lighting, there is no inaccessible seat in the house. So I spent so much money on an accessible seat expecting it to be a very stroby show, and I didn't need to because you can sit all the way on the side and there is no light straining stuff. I haven't found that because I sat on the side the second time that I saw it. So it's, yeah, just buy any ticket that you can get, go see it. Also, thank you for being so wonderful about my weird January video schedule. I appreciate it. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it is never too late to start over, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.